Hi, Ray here and welcome to my new channel. This is also a new place, so if it's a bit echoey, I will sort that out by the next video. I have been studying psychology for 5 years now and I absolutely love psychology, especially as a hobby. And even though I no longer study it, I still want to talk about it and research more. And I thought I'd make this video so I could actually begin looking into psychology again and fulfill my hobby and also teach some people along the way. These videos will be perfect whether or not you're a student or just someone who's also interested in psychology, as I will be using terms that students will need to use in their exams, but I'll also be defining those terms so people can watch these videos whether or not you have pre-existing knowledge, because I will explain as much as I can and I will try and make these fun. But psychology is always fun to me, so hopefully I can make these fun. So today I thought I would talk about obedience. Now, obedience is a form of social influence where an individual will follow an order given to them, usually by an authority figure, and it's said that we wouldn't act this way had we not been ordered to do it. I'm going to talk about a controversial study today by Stanely Milgram, and it is controversial for a lot of reasons that we will get into. Now, you should know a bit about Stanely Milgram first. He was an American psychologist who was brought up in a Jewish family, so he was also Jewish. And this is very important when I talk about this study, because Milgram started his study in 1963 after the trials of Adolf Eichmann. He was appointed head of the Department for Jewish Affairs during World War II, specifically the department that was responsible for the emigration of Jewish people into the ghettos and the concentration camps. During his trial, Eichmann insisted he was only following orders. This is a direct quote that I'm going to read. "There is a need to draw a line between the leaders responsible and the people like me forced to serve as mere instruments." Despite the fact that Eichmann said that he had no responsibility and that it was all due to his command, he was hung for his crimes. And during a class one day, Milgram wondered whether or not American people would have reacted the exact same way, and whether or not the Germans were just following orders and they weren't just bad people. And one of his classmates said, "We wouldn't do that, we would never hurt someone like that, the Holocaust could never happen in America." And Milgram said, "How do you know unless it actually happens?" So he was interested in seeing if Germans in particular were more likely to be obedient to an authority figure. And he wanted to do this to try and explain the events of the Holocaust and World War II. He wanted to know if Eichmann and his accomplices really were just following orders, and that was all it was. So what he did, he used a volunteer sample. So he basically just put an ad out in the paper and was like, "Hey, I need some males between these ages to come and do a study for me," and people just decided to come on their own accord. 40 males turned up between the ages of 20 and 50, and Milgram said that the experiment was one of memory, and that he wanted to see if punishment would help improve memory or not. This was obviously a lie, and Milgram's real aim was to see to what extent we would obey to an authority figure, even if it involved harming another person. Volunteers were introduced to who they believed was a volunteer, but he was actually a Confederate. Now, a Confederate is someone who is part of the study, they know exactly what's going on, and they just pretend to be a participant. They were then randomly picked to either be a teacher or a learner. But the Confederates were always the learner and the participants were always the teacher. The Confederate was then led into a room and strapped into electrodes, and the teacher was taken into a separate room and placed in front of a panel of buttons. And this was called a shock generator. An authority figure, a man in a lab coat, told the participant to shock the learner if he got anything wrong, and increase the shocks each time. The shocks range from 15, which is a slight shock, to 450 volts, which is a dangerous level. And there were 30 switches in total, so you'd have to give someone 30 shocks to reach the maximum amount of shocks. I can't even imagine having to shock someone 30 times. Obviously, the participants wanted to stop. They did not want to continue as soon as the volts got to a point where the Confederate would be screaming and asking it to be stopped. But the authority figure was told to prod them. Firstly, please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And then you have no choice but to continue. So I did want to keep some continuity with the shirt, but my new hair and different background really give away that it's a different day. But I got interrupted last time and I have a big chunk of information that I need to give you, which is quite necessary for the study, i.e. the results and conclusion. So the participants could hear the Confederates screaming from the other room, and this was a tape recording. So it was the same throughout all the studies. They used the same tape recording, the same screams, the same things that happened. And at one point, The Confederate even said that he had a heart condition, and if you know anything about heart conditions, voltage is not very good for them. And that means that the Confederate could have actually died from these shocks. At one point, one of the participants asked who would be held responsible if anything happened to the person in there. And the authority figure said that he would take all responsibility if he got hurt or anything happened. And the man continued after knowing he wouldn't be held responsible. At 375 volts, there's a scream and then nothing. The Confederate no longer responds to the questions that the teacher or participant is asking them. And yet the participant is still told to carry on and continue with shocks, which, if you were there and the whole experiment is about memory and about whether or not someone could learn, why would you have to keep shocking someone who may not be even conscious at this point? Because it won't do anything for the experiment. Milgram was reported to have asked psychiatrists about what percentage of Americans they thought would obey for the study, and they said just 1% of people would do it, that's it. Shockingly, 65% of people went all the way to 450 volts. Worse so, every single participant went up to 300 volts. That is scary to even think about. It was concluded that ordinary people are likely to follow an order given to them by an authority figure, even if it meant hurting someone, or even to the extent of killing another human being. It's believed that we learn this response to legitimate authority through childhood and growing up. We have parents that we look up to and they order us around, then we go to school and teachers tell us what to do, and then even into work where our bosses give us orders and we just follow them. So this is the learned behaviour. Are there any factors that change the amount that we're likely to obey? There has been a total of 636 participants over 18 variations of this Milgram study. It was found that if someone was wearing ordinary clothes over a lab coat, obedience went down to 20%. Only 20% of people went all the way up to 450 volts rather than 65%. If the location would change from Yale University, which is a very prestigious university, to some rundown offices, obedience went to 47.5%, which is still quite a lot. If the participant could have an assistant who would push the button for them, obedience went all the way up to 92.5%, because the responsibility is resolved even more, so they don't actually have any responsibility because they didn't press a button, they just told someone else to after being told to do it. On the flip side, if they had to touch the Confederate hand and place it onto an electric shock pad, obedience went down to 30%. And if there were two Confederates that played the role of the teacher like the participant is doing, and they refused to shock, obedience went down to 10%. And finally, if the authority figure is absent and they're just told to carry on with the study without them, obedience dropped to 20.5%, with people cheating and missing shocks or giving less voltage than they were instructed to. For me, I'm going to go back to future Ray to tell you whether or not the study is actually good, and I'll be evaluating it for you. Something you'll hear me say a lot is ecological validity, and this is the idea of whether or not a study will show how we'll actually behave in a real life setting. For example, the study was done in a lab, and even though that's good because it means it can be controlled and we can test it again and again, it's also bad because we don't know if these people would have reacted this way had it been a real life setting, and whether or not they were just doing it because they thought they had to do it because it's a study. Orne and Holland said that the study lacked experimental realism and said that the participants may have not believed that the shocks were even real, and they could have seen through all the lies that Milgram fed them. Although if you talk later on about some ethical issues this study has, I really doubt this considering the amount of psychological trauma and distress that has been shown through these participants. I really doubt that's the case. But it could be a factor for some of the participants. And there has actually been real life studies of Milgram's experiment, which I will talk about in part 2 because otherwise this video will be so long. Another issue with this study is that the sample is very biased, as it's just white males from one part of America between the ages of 20 to 50. And we have no idea if other genders would react the same way, if people of other ages would react the same way. And also if places other than America would react the same way. And even in non-Western cultures where the upbringing is so different to how it is in Westernized cultures, we don't know how they would react. We only know about this small portion of America. And even though there are other studies that have been done, none have been done in non-Westernized cultures. So we still don't know how other people would react from different places. And that means that the study can't go very far. The main thing about this study, which is why I said it was so controversial in the beginning, is the ethical issues. I'm going to start off light and then I'm going to go a bit deeper into how bad it actually was. So the first one is just deception. Milgram lied. He said the study was about this. He said that the Confederate was a participant. You know, he lied. Well, sometimes in experiments you have to lie. And if the lie is beneficial to the experiment, you can usually do it. But keep in mind, this was before the ethics board actually came into place in psychology, and before studies were thoroughly checked before they were done. And despite the fact that participants were deceived, 83.7% of people were actually okay with the fact that they were, and they were glad that they took part in the study, with 1.3% of people wishing they hadn't been part of it. Another one that was very bad is protection from harm. Now, this isn't just physical harm, this can also be emotional and psychological harm. There were signs of tension throughout the study from the participants. There was trembling, nervous laughter. They dug their fingernails into their palms. There's actually talk of a participant who actually had a seizure during this because of the amount of stress that they felt doing this study. But Milgram argued that this was short-lived, and when he checked up on the participants a year later, most of them were living normal, happy lives and had put the study behind them. The final one is right to withdraw. Now, as there was constant prodding when a participant wanted to leave, a lot of people have said that this study didn't give the participants the right to withdraw. And what that basically means is your right to leave the study at any point, whether it be at the beginning, midway through, even after the study, there is a period of time where you can ask them to remove your result. And a lot of people have said that Milgram did not give his participants the right to withdraw. However, this isn't accurate. It was a lot more difficult to withdraw, yes, definitely, but that was the whole point, the whole prodding to see if people would just follow authority figures. Since only 65% of people actually continued to the end of the study, that means 35% of people technically did withdraw halfway through and decided not to continue. So it definitely was a possibility, it just seemed like it wasn't. That was a lot of information, I know. I am going to do a part 2 of this where I'm going to talk about Hoffling and a nursery that was done in a real life setting, as well as the authoritarian personality, which could be a factor in whether or not we're more likely to obey. And also I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this means towards Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to subscribe. Comment what you'd like me to do and I might research it and make a video about it. And I'll see you all soon.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one. Slow. Wrong. Answer is neck. 300 volts.